You're listening to Opera Box Score.
Let's get ready to rumble!
Wherever you are, however you're listening, it's America's talk radio show about opera. It's Opera Box Score. I'm Weston Williams, joined by Oliver Camacho and Ashley Hardgrave. All right, this week we go inside the huddle with Ricky Ian Gordon, the prolific American composer of operas such as A Coffin in Egypt, The Grapes of Wrath, and Orpheus and Euridice, has another credit to add: author. Ricky will share anecdotes from his new memoir, Seeing Through, a chronicle of sex, drugs, and opera. And then a field report from an advanced screening of Maria Callas' biopic from the New York Film Festival. Will it be opera-gloved thumbs down or opera-gloved thumbs up? Plus, in the 2-minute drill, Dresden's rolling in cash, Berlin's broke, and Apple Classical has taken another tiny step towards world domination. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Spotify. Click follow. On Apple Podcasts, hit the plus sign, send us a voice memo, or email us your hot takes, mailbag@operaboxscore.com, or you can just record your thoughts using the You Got Something to Say tab on our website, operaboxscore.com. However you contribute, you'll get an OBS beer coaster, an OBS lapel pin, and a #1 OBS fan foam finger just for sharing your own hot take. And without further ado, Oliver Camacho is not here yet, but he will be when we record the interview with Ricky Ian Gordon. So in the meantime, Ashley Hardgrave, how's it going?
It's great. We did it. We did it, White Sox. My beloved, lovable losers, the Chicago White Sox, closed out their season with 121 losses, which is the most in modern Major League Baseball history. They take this record over from the 1962 Mets. The owner, Jerry Reinsdorf, wrote a letter to fans promising better, but he's also been promising better for a while. And honestly, I'm starting to wonder if he's doing a Don Sterling LA Clippers thing where he wants them to just be like the lovable losers so that he can funnel money through there like he did for, the years between 1981 and 2014, minus, like scandals and racism and like the recorded phone calls that takes him down. To my knowledge, no one has recorded any Jerry Reinsdorf phone calls that will publicly embarrass him.
I certainly hope it will remain that way. Let's talk some opera.
Huddle up. Let's go inside the huddle.
Content warning ahead: sex, drugs, and opera. It's all there in the title, and Ricky Ian Gordon is very candid about his personal experiences with those three things. Oliver and I will be recording our interview with Ricky just before we publish this episode later this week, so I'm not sure which of those three topics will dominate. You know Oliver always talking about drugs. Here is our conversation with Ricky Ian Gordon.
Will There Really Be a Morning? A song by Ricky Ian Gordon. We heard the new recording featuring Nadine Sierra. And our guest today is Ricky Ian Gordon. Welcome to Opera Box Score.
Thank you for having me.
So Weston and I have experienced your book, the title of which is Seeing Through Sex, Drugs, and Opera.
Seeing Through, a Chronicle of Sex, Drugs, and Opera.
Okay. So I think clearly that's going to be the episode title. It's going to be Sex, Drugs, and Opera featuring Ricky Ian Gordon. And, for me, reading this book, I wasn't shocked about anything. What I was shocked about was that you would let other people read this book besides people like me. It's like, this book was written for me. But I'm thinking about Weston. Weston and I are friends, but we don't know about each other's personal lives that much. Weston, are you like Catholic or some kind of Christian or something like that?
I some flavor if you go back in there for sure. Yeah. It was certainly, the experience of reading it is not something I could recommend to every single person I know, but it was a deeply, deeply moving book. And actually, as a matter of fact, when I was reading it, there were a number of times, Oliver, when I was like, because initially I was just going to be the only one who read it and reported back. And there was a certain point where I'm like, Oliver needs to read this book specifically.
Yeah. Well, just so the audience knows what we're talking about, you don't waste any time
No.
at the start of the book in just telling people things that are extremely personal. And I feel like it's almost like, okay, well, if you can get past this chapter, then you can read the rest of this book. What did your editor say about, or did your editor actually give you the idea to organize it that way?
So my editor was Jonathan Galassi, and he's a great editor, and he bought the book those were the chapters I sent him right from the beginning. And I had no intention of publishing this book. One of the questions you said you were going to ask me is, how did I decide to be so candid at the top of the book? But the whole point of, I had started a writing group during the pandemic, and I was in quarantine, just like everybody else. And the writing group I started was full of writers I deeply admire. And I wanted to impress them, but I knew I'm not going to impress them as a stylist with the beauty of each of my sentences. What I have to give them is my truth, what is true for me. And it was a way of being intimate with them, like saying, this is who I am. And so as I started writing, it was very cathartic for me. And I would read it to them, and they would be shocked at its candor. And so one day, one of the writers, Nick Flynn, was talking about that there was a kind of energy in the writing. And truly on a lark, I just sent some of what I was writing to Jonathan Galassi and said, Jonathan, you don't even have to read this, but if you do, I sort of can guarantee you that it might be different from any other composer memoir you would read.
I read some of Ned Rorem's, diaries, but this goes a little bit further.
Yeah, and that's the truth. Is so. Yeah. I think that's what attracted him to it, and he was not shocked. He was supportive, and to tell you the truth, like you guys, there was a moment when I knew, okay, this book is going to be published, and it was the first time I went back to the Met after the quarantine, when you could get in you waited online and you had the evidence of your vaccines and masks, and I remember sitting at the Met that night and seeing Heidi Waleson from the Village Voice walking down the aisle, thinking, Heidi Welson's going to know a lot more about me.
Oh, the Wall Street Journal.
Yes. So I was scared then, but as soon as the book came out, and obviously the press was pretty good, and I thought there was a kind of power in it for me, because I felt like, well, this is me saying, this is who I am. And it truly is who I am. And it's quite detailed, and you either like me or you don't like me. But at least it's not reliant on my notes, which you are often, as I say in the book, revered and reviled for something you do that can be quite abstract. And this book is not abstracted. It's very intimate, and it's the truth. So I thought it somehow oddly made me feel more powerful, because I felt like I had more agency.
Well, we're going to talk about opera in just a moment. We have a lot of questions about opera, but I just want the audience to know, especially if you are a gay man of a certain age, let's say your 40s or older, you've heard me say this many times on the podcast, and I'll say it again for new listeners, that our generation didn't have mentors who are your generation, Ricky. And I think we lost more than just mentors. We also lost a handing down of culture. And I feel like my generation is ignorant of so many things that I'm crazy about. And I wonder, where are my people? We were never taught the things that you have to teach, the things you have to share. And in experiencing your book, I felt like, oh my gosh, this has been missing. This exact frank talk about the body, about desire, about sex, and about art. This is all the stuff that I needed to hear when I was 19, when I was 20, So, yeah, it really means a lot to me. So,
you know what? That's very moving for me to hear, because I don't even think I thought of it that way, Oliver. I mean, for me, I was just obviously a lot of the things I talked about happened in the dead center of my life, so when you say that to me, it makes me feel a whole other layer of gratitude about having written it, because to feel like I went through something and expressing that is useful to a whole other generation, that's really touching to me. And, just to say, you guys too, it hasn't only been gay people of a certain age that have responded to the book, which has been, I got a call. There's a guy named Mark Horowitz who he's in charge of all the archives at the Library of Congress. And he's married with, he said, your book is helping me live my life in a different way, because I never even imagined someone could be that frank. And I like hearing that, because it's like, we live in a culture that is so dishonest in so many ways. It feels like an act of anarchy, to tell the truth.
Well, here's how I'm going to bring it to opera. People who've been listening to the show for the past year know that I had an experience watching Pelléas and Mélisande and meeting for the first time a young baritone named Hugh Montague Rendell. His father's David Rendell, the tenor. His mother's Dinah Montague, the mezzo-soprano. Yeah. And Hugh is an incredible musician. And I like Pelléas. I'm not obsessed with it, but like after hearing him sing Pelléas, I was like, oh my gosh, like it was so touching. And I'm not stalking him. I'm not like sending him a dress or anything like that. But I really have become like a huge fan of his. And I said to him when I met him, it's like, oh, you're going to sing Billy Budd. Like this role was meant for you. And he probably knew that he was, but he couldn't tell me because the contract wasn't officially signed. But he, in fact, is about to sing Billy Budd next month at Vienna State Opera. It's his role debut. And when I think of him singing this role, I get emotional because he's so beautiful and he's so authentic as an artist. He's so thoughtful. And to think of somebody like him who's so just embodies, the love of music, to think of him dying on stage, it's like, I can't. I can't. So can you talk about Billy Budd while like...
Well, I'll tell you, by the way, that, I'm close with Nathan Gunn. And it was when I saw Nathan do it at the Met that I was very upset in a way I had never been upset watching this opera. Because, just to say about Nathan, a lot of people like all that sort of barahunk stuff. That is so not who Nathan is, like not even remotely. He's a really thoughtful, introspective, intelligent man. And I felt when I watched Billy Budd at the Met, I couldn't make peace anymore with who those people are. I felt like Captain Vere is a coward and evil wins in that opera. Mm. And it made me sick when I watched it. And it truly did. And I even feel like that the opera didn't even know what I was supposed to feel, because Benjamin Britten writing Captain Vere for Peter Pears, right? And that music, it's romantic, it's beautiful, it's reflective, but really it's horrible that Captain Vere does what he does and lets Claggart get away with destroying a human being in that way. And so I love that opera and I hate that opera. And one of the most powerful moments in that opera is when the men, after Billy Budd dies, and they're just like, when they're just moaning to the music. It's so incredible. And by the way, it's also obviously very powerful that the music is used in that Beau Travail, the movie Beau Travail, which is the retelling of the Billy Budd story in the, French. It's French army. It's very powerful. And that's how I think, and growing up, I love Billy Budd. And I think one of the first melodies I loved in my life is da, 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 da 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 da. You know, that beautiful melody that's on the saxophone. So I have very complicated feelings about it. And frankly, Oliver, I'm happy that I'm going to see your friend do it because it might be a whole new experience for me and in Vienna.
This is what is in the book for people who haven't read it yet. You have ideas about operas and you have these like lists and you just like rattle off like pages of ideas about things that you love. And it's really a book. It could be a separate book, just how you talk about opera. I can pull all those parts out of this memoir. But of course, you're also a composer. And Weston and I wanted to ask you about some of your works. Weston?
Well, absolutely. One of the things that's so apparent in, not just in the book, but if you listen to any of your compositions, you have this, and even just now, you know, the deep love you have for these singers and the human voice. And you really get the sense whenever you hear something from like, say Grapes of Wrath, which you talk about in the book as being a great success or premiere with what was Minnesota Opera. And just like the care you have for the voice when you compose, and compose something as iconic that could be really sort of almost, monolithic. This big, great American novel is now becoming an opera, but you make it so human and so personal. What was that process like specifically with Grapes of Wrath for you?
Well, I'm glad the thing is, Weston, what you said about that could be ... I mean, obviously that was like, could have been the sword of Damocles hanging over my head.
Yes.
What you have to do is you have to personalize those stories and you have to decide who those people are inside of you. And because I love the voice more than anything in the world, assigning that incredible story and those beautiful characters to a voice in my head that felt right to me. And especially a lot of times I write, at the time, I was very close with Lorraine Hunt Lieberson. And really, I was writing Ma Jode for Lorraine. And she knew it, and then she got sick. But it was always for that kind of voice and that kind of heart. So if you listen to the recording and you hear Deanne Meek, that's what Deanne Meek was to me. And she knew it. She was the essential, exquisite, lyric mezzo-soprano who had A's, beautiful A's and a B flat, but that earthly color in her voice. There was such a thing and then to decide, for example, that Casey, this sort of deposed preacher who's basically what he aspires to is the highest thing in the opera. So he has the highest voice. He has the tenor voice. It was such a privilege to make music to that story. And that, as I say in the book, I had never read the book. I lied and said I need to reread it. So when I read it, and I just thought, who am I to turn this story into an opera? I mean, this little, Jew from Long Island. But I thought at least then I had enough foresight to know if something like this is thrown into your lap, you have to say, yes, this is fate. And I knew as I was doing it that I was finding that story deep inside of me. I just did, and there were moments like when I wrote the whole Noah scene, and then I wrote the lullaby in about an hour. And I called Kevin, my partner at the office. At the time, he was the deputy editor of Condé Nast Traveler. And I said, you have to hear this. And I sang it to him over the phone. I knew there was something happening where it felt like, ooh, something really big is happening. And I remember the first day in rehearsals when they first brought the truck into the room. And I cried. I just felt like, wow, this is so much bigger than me. Like the Jodes are here and this story is taking flight and it's bigger than me and it's bigger than Michael Corey and bigger than Rosalind Elias. It was so profound. And now I've had that experience many times because that was my first big, big opera. I mean, there was Tibetan Book of the Dead before that, but that was like writing an opera in the intensive care ward. So now I've had that experience many times of feeling like they are here. Gertrude Stein is here. Alice B.
Right.
Toklas is here. It's very profound feeling to give voice to those characters. And, you know, Weston, one thing you said, I say it, but my mother was a singer. My greatest desire is to give singers something that ennobles them on the stage, you know, and in their bodies and in their voice. And so it's a very big privilege. And luckily, not to say, oh, and I'm good at it, but to say, I think I'm good at it. I love voices. I know what will make them sound great.
I think it's absolutely fair to say you're good at it. I mean, one of the most remarkable things about your style, I think there's a big sort of conflict that often happens in contemporary opera where you have like sometimes really singable stuff, but it is very much imitative of a style that, frankly, in my opinion, has been dead a long time. Or you have something that is hyper modern, trying to go to these heights of intellect and emotion, but no one can sing it. You know, the singability and the idea of ennobling the performer, not just as a character, but as a person, I think is something that really comes through in your music, and the affection for the performers come through in your book as well. I want to talk a little bit about, your chamber opera Ellen West as well, because that's a great example of the book. When I read it, you know, I could tell you had a special affection for this opera, and in some ways, you know, you almost had this almost autobiographical connection to the main character. Can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
When my partner Jeffrey died in 1996, I was a poet friend, Michael Klein, steered me to the work of Frank Bedard. And it was actually one poem in particular, a poem of his called The Yoke, which is a poem he wrote about losing his friend Joe Brainerd. But the poem was so powerful to me, and I started reading the rest of his work, and I found something in his work I had never seen before, which was so many things. One thing was just the way it looked on the page, the way he used capitals, the way he used italics, the way he used white space, you know. But he had these three poems. One was called Herbert White, about basically a murderer. One was called Ellen West, and one was called The War of Václav Nijinsky. Ellen West is in really two voices, the voice of a doctor and the voice of a patient named Ellen West, who has an eating disorder. Before there were words like anorexia or bulimia, she was based on a real person. It was Dr. Binswanger, who kept a diary about a patient of his, and he called her Ellen West. But he wrote a book. It was a very powerful case study about this woman, Ellen West. And Frank read it, I believe, when he was at Wellesley. And it stayed with him. And eventually he made this poem out of that case study. And when I read it, I have struggled my whole life, not only with eating issues, with issues regarding my body, with issues of expectation. It's a very painful thing for me. I have a series of expectations for myself, and if I don't meet them every day, there is a kind of pain that engulfs me. And I try to be very honest about it in the book. And in Ellen West, what eventually kills this woman is her ideals. Her ideals don't allow her to live in the world where her own fallibility makes it impossible to live. And so I have chosen instead to participate in the vulnerability of that, and to talk about it, and to be in the solution for me, which is honesty. And that's for me the solution to everything. I mean, when I gave up drugs and I gave up alcohol, and in a way, when I stopped, all my sex addictions and obsessions, what was left was these threads of the expectation, the sadness, the grief, and I just started talking about them, and Ellen West embodied them. I mean, and I talk about this, but in the very last thing that happens in that opera, she writes a letter to her friend who's still in the hospital, and the doctor has finally let her go home. And she goes home with her husband, and he sings this thing about, on the third day of being home, she is as if transformed. And she eats to the point where she's finally full. She eats chocolates. She takes walks with him. She reads poetry. And that night, she takes a fatal dose of poison and kills herself. And so it ends with a letter that she wrote to her friend where she says, "Dearest, I remember how at 18, on hikes with friends, when they rested, and it's all about how she had to hike around them. She couldn't allow herself to rest because she was not yet truly thin." And that resonated with me on such a painful level. The idea that she wasn't who she was meant to be yet, so she couldn't eat, she couldn't participate, she couldn't rest, she couldn't. And I hate to admit it, but that's me in a lot of ways. And that's why I took drugs. That's why I took speed every day to try to live up to some ideal that was basically impossible for me to live up to. I decided it sat inside of me for many years. And one day, like 15 years after I discovered the poem, I wrote to Frank Bedard. I found him on Facebook or whatever, and I asked him if he would give me the rights to the poem. And I told him about Jeffrey, and I told him about my ideas about the poem and why I would want to set it. And he wrote me back a very loving note and said yes. And it was setting that poem to music. I mean, I was in Houston premiering another opera, The House Without a Christmas Tree, which was very different from Ellen West, a family story. And I would wake up at 4:00 and write Ellen West. And it was cathartic, and it also sent me into a deep depression. That's when I got on medication, which has helped. But I went somewhere really far away for writing that piece. And I don't know if you've heard it, but I think it's very beautiful and very haunting. And it also, I had an experience with writing that piece. Frank Bedard is not only an established poet, he's considered one of the greatest living poets. I mean, he won the Pulitzer. And for me to say to him when I was done setting Ellen West to music, Frank, I think what it is what I felt suddenly like I needed a prologue and an epilogue. It was like I had created something. It felt mythological to me. It needed to be introduced and it needed to be finished. And for me to say that to a poet of that stature and say, I need more, and then like bicker back and forth with him about what it should be, it was a very big moment for me. It was really big for me to own my own sense of dramaturgy and that I needed something more than what was on the page. And then for me to go through that with him and for him to, and I have that all in the book, all of that stuff about him, right? Arguing with
the dick measuring contest.
Yes, but it was so powerful. It was so powerful. And for me to think that it had to begin with the yoke and Frank saying, no, that isn't who she is, that isn't how this should start. It was, and for us to finally settle on what it was. And one day I'm at jury duty and Frank Bedard calls me on the phone and says, I know what should be the epilogue. And he reads me that incredible poem, Hymn, that ends the opera. And it was like, oh my God, bless you for this. And that is collaboration, you guys.
Yeah.
That's what writing an opera is.
We're running out of time, but I wanted to get your thoughts on one final question. And it relates to Ellen West, since Ellen West as a Beth Morrison commission. Where are we right now in opera history? What since you have done so much in both millenniums, where do you see the audience being and the composer? Now, you're not a monolith, but I personally sense American opera sounding more like Ricky Ian Gordon than it sounded like maybe even in the 80s or 90s. So I don't know if you feel like you're part of this or if you are understanding the trend, and who maybe are the composers who are taking that idea and pushing it forward. I don't know. Since you're the thick of it, I'd like to know where you think we are.
Well, for that, I will say one thing I will own, you guys, is that the Grapes of Wrath, because of the success of Grapes of Wrath, it did sort of open the door towards a renaissance of American opera, because suddenly every opera company was commissioning a new opera. Because even opera companies realized they could make more of a splash with a new piece. So owning that and feeling good at being at the helm of that, I feel like, and then I feel like the language had to change, because you could no longer, the composers who in the 20th century were scared out of writing in their own voice because they would be so harshly criticized for not being serial or not being aleatoric or not being, that's over. Because if you want an audience, it can't be a steady diet of that kind of music, even though certain critics are still scolding composers for writing how they write. But where I think we are, and it is with people like you mentioned, Jake, I would say, Missy Mazzoli, David T. Little. We have a lot of people that are writing in a really interesting style that also everyone is in their own way an iconoclast. And the only thing I would say is that I'm not sure, is that kind of work going to happen at the Met, or is it going to happen in a black box theater somewhere, or is it going to happen in a swimming pool the way my Orpheus and Euridice did, or is it going to happen in a closet or in a cemetery? I think as an opera composer now, you have to be open to writing exactly what you want to write and finding where that piece would be most properly represented. And that may not be the Lyric Opera of Chicago or the Met. I was very lucky to do Intimate Apparel at the Lincoln Center Theater. Here was this opera that was 300 people were in the theater hearing those amazing voices, and it was intimate, and you could see every move their face made. And Bart Scher directed it like a theater piece, and I was very proud of it. And I know I was lucky, even, by the way, that they sent a theater reviewer to review it. So what did he say? He called it a knockout. If it was Zach Wolf, he probably would have said it was a turd. You know what I mean? And that's where we are now. Basically, most of the time, critics kill new work, even if when it's all gone, what are they going to write about? But that's where we are. So I have somehow dodged bullets sometimes in a very lucky way. And I hope that for my colleagues. And I do absolutely think the form is alive and thriving. But it is all about composers listening to their own voice, not thinking they have to write grand opera if they don't hear it, okay? And not thinking they have to be at the Met when they don't see their work on that scale. And what you see a lot of times is a piece that doesn't belong at the Met, that should have been intimate and is suddenly blown up out of proportion at the Met.
Yeah.
So for me, the trick of me being Ricky Ian Gordon is me following my own impulses and seeing where it takes me. And that has been useful to me. And if I'm a good example to other composers, it's because I think I followed my own muse, and to thine own self be true.
Such company, as keeps this young nymph joy. Such company, as keeps this young nymph joy.
Nicole Cabell and Ricky Ian Gordon performing Ricky Ian Gordon's Joy. Our thanks to Macmillan Publishers for putting us in contact with Ricky Ian Gordon. Once again, the name of the book is Seeing Through, a Chronicle of Sex, Drugs, and Opera. Weston, I know that you already recorded the front half of this episode, but did you expect the conversation to go in that direction?
I predicted it beat for beat, Oliver.
And we had so many more topics we wanted to get to, but as you can hear, Ricky is, you just press the play button and he'll go.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's so exciting. Ricky is very much a consummate artist. And, whenever you meet someone who has that, sort of connection, you just want to kind of sit back and hear them talk, I think.
Yeah, you got something to say? Then yeah, all right, you can say something. This is Listener Mailbag.
Netflix just released the first teaser trailer for Maria, the Maria Callas biopic, last week, but PJ, as usual, is 2 steps ahead. He managed to snag a preview showing in New York City, and he has this report.
Hello, Opera Box Score. It's PJ with a report from the movies. Last night I was very fortunate to be able to attend the pre-screening New York Film Festival edition of Maria, the Maria Callas movie that's come out in Venice just recently at festivals and will be in movie theaters on the 27th of the month of November, then on Netflix quickly after that. It was really a remarkable event. We had the director, Pablo Larraín, a man from Chile who's done a number of really remarkable films. We also had Angelina Jolie and some of the other cast members there on stage, which was really exciting. It was a full house, of course, as you can imagine. Almost all screenings at New York Film Festival are sold out. This was at Alice Tully Hall, right a stone's throw from the Metropolitan Opera, and a ton of Met people were there. All of the brass, everybody who was anybody was there from the Met to observe this really remarkable film. I'm not going to give you any kind of review. I'm not really qualified to do that, other than I was blown away, enjoyed every second of it. The audience received it extremely well, and I think this is going to do a lot for opera globally. If you watch this, you want to go to the opera, and I think the effect of the magnification of the art form is really going to benefit all of us who love this art form. I will say that on the subway home afterward, I quickly downloaded from Audible Diva by Daisy Goodwin, which is a novelization. This is my speed, I guess, at this point. A novelization of the life of Maria Callas. And believe it or not, the audiobook has musical selections of Callas at different points in her life. So I'm already diving deep into this wonderful novel, Diva. That's my report from New York. I'll have some real opera news for you soon.
Thanks once again to PJ, and I'm kind of hyped about this movie now. I think PJ said it best when he was talking about how this movie and movies about classical music and opera really have the opportunity to really bring in new audiences into the mainstream. I will say, I wonder how many times that actually plays out as we hope it would. I mean, I think Amadeus certainly was that, right? It was a huge moment for Mozart. The amount of Mozart in the public, it's kind of hard to imagine now the difference between the non-classical music going public's knowledge and enjoyment of Mozart before Amadeus and after. It really was a massive difference. But at the same time, Ashley, how many people went out to go see West Side Story after Maestro came out?
I mean, not nearly as many, because again, we're doing this and we're having this conversation when this film is being released in a very different era of how we consume media and how we watch movies. However, the story of Maria Callas in general is just so fantastical, so over the top.
True.
So even though this film is going to be dedicated to a very specific portion of her life, I do think it will pique the interest of people who are just going to understand what a wild, crazy, fascinating narrative she has. Although I'm a little anxious and a little apprehensive about it for like the dumbest reasons ever. Like, Callas is ours. Like, she's ours. And like, we're the ones that know about her. And I know that I'm usually the one preaching from the rooftops about like, opera's for everybody. Everybody should know about this. And yes, I do agree with that. But also now I'm like, but more people are going to know about our special lady. Is it going to be okay? Is her memory going to be preserved the same way? I might be thinking about it too hard. I have way too many like personal stakes put into Callas culture in a way that's probably unfair, but I hope we do right by her as a culture as we start to appreciate her more post the release of this film.
This just in. The 2-minute drill.
All right, listen up. Here's everything you need to know about what happened in Operaland this week.
An updated version of Apple Music Classical was released last month with the new iOS, which includes more than 50,000 digital album notes, including libretti. The step forward is significant considering the fact that the service is currently the largest digital classical music catalog on the streaming market. However, liner notes of a significant number of older recordings and more obscure works have yet to be included in the program.
San Francisco Symphony's season opener of Verdi's Requiem was canceled an hour and a half before the downbeat as members of its chorus went on strike. 100% of the chorus voted in favor of the action. The Requiem Mass was meant to be the first concert of music director Esa-Pekka Salinen's final season with the orchestra.
The city of Dresden has received a whopping 15 million euros from the Kulturinvest for the construction of the new Richard Wagner Academy of the Dresden Music Festival, a center focused on 19th century performance practice. The academy will now include a 600-seat concert hall, as well as orchestra and choir rehearsal spaces. Quote, a visionary meeting place, the Wagner Academy Dresden can now be built on the most beautiful site in the city, said Jan Vogler, artistic director of the festival. This decision inspires me to continue to invest all my energy in the cultural charisma of Dresden as one of the world's leading cities of music.
Dresden's music scene may be flush with cash, but Berlin is feeling the pinch. Multiple cultural leaders, including conductors, directors, and full-on arts organizations, have released statements appealing to the Senate to not carry out proposed arts budget cuts to cover a shortfall in the city. Quote, culture is the heart of Berlin. It attracts people from all over the world, is an important economic factor, creates jobs, and makes our city worth living in, reads a statement from no less than 4 Berlin-based opera houses, 3 orchestras, and a ballet company. Our city's cultural institutions are not only pieces of art with international appeal, but are also urgently needed to maintain Berlin's reputation as a location for business.
The San Antonio Philharmonic has been sued by former board members of the San Antonio Symphony for an alleged $180,000 in defaulted loans. David Wood and Colette Holt claim they bought the former San Antonio Symphony's assets out of bankruptcy and donated them to the new San Antonio Philharmonic after the musicians reformed the orchestra in 2022. Wood accused executive director Robert Trevino of refusing to respond to board members, disabling all their email accounts, and removing their names from the Philharmonic's website. Trevino denies these claims.
Ding, ding, ding! It's a major awards roundup. Opera and Welt magazine has announced their 2024 winners. Opera House of the Year is Oper Frankfurt for the 3rd year in a row. Singer of the Year is John Osborne for his portrayal of Eleazar in La Juive, and Asmik Grigorian for Salome in Hamburg, Turandot in Vienna, and Lisa in Pique Dame in Munich. Lydia Steyer was voted Director of the Year for her production of Aida in Frankfurt. Matthew Wilde's Frankfurt Tannhäuser shared the Performance of the Year title with Lorenzo Fiorini's Moses and Aaron in Bonn.
The Premio Visconti for Best Set Design for Opera has been awarded to Doriana and Massimiliano Fuxas for Opera Theatre of Rome's production of Tosca and Turandot at the Carcalla Festival.
Composer of the Hours, Kevin Putz, has won Lu Zhao Lao Zhao's Best Composer in Shanghai. Oksana Liniv has been awarded the Bavarian Constitutional Order, and in major citizenship awards, Riccardo Muti has received the honorary citizenship from the municipality of Andria.
In trade news, Gabriele Venzago will be the new General Music Director of State Theater Mainz and Chief Conductor of the State Theater Philharmonic Mainz, effective next season. He succeeds Hermann Boehmer, who has held both positions since 2011.
Mass Opera has appointed Jessica Bloch-Moisand as their new artistic director. She will be taking over for Dana Lynn Varga. who is ending her tenure and transitioning to the role of artistic advisor.
Donizetti Opera Festival has announced that artistic director Francesco Micheli will step down at the end of the 2024 season. Said Micheli, "Thanks to our work today, Gaetano lives and fights with us from Bergamo around the world."
Applications for the 2025-2026 American Opera Initiative are now open. Composers and librettists who have not yet received a major operatic commission are encouraged to go to the Kennedy Center website and search for the call for applications under their Education tab, accepting entries through October 15th. Or, better yet, follow the link at operaboxscore.com.
Exit stage right. English soprano and early music expert Deborah Roberts has died at the age of 72. Roberts sang with the Callas Scholars from 1978 to 2008 and won first place in the 1981 early music competition in Bruges, Belgium. In addition to teaching and appearing on over 60 recordings with the Callas Scholars, Roberts founded Musica Secreta, an ensemble of female voices in continuo, and the Brighton Early Music Festival.
Wayne Gooding, former editor for the Opera Canada magazine, died last month. Gooding worked at the publication for over 25 years.
Ukrainian-born baritone Vladislav Veretsnikov has died at 77. He was most associated with the Bolshoi Theater, performing 41 roles there beginning in 1978. He also taught at Moscow State Institute of Music and the Galina Vizhnevskaya Opera Singing Center. Originally from Kharkiv, he was married to fellow Ukrainian soprano Lyudmila Sergenko.
And on this day, September 30th, in 1732, it was the first performance of Pergolese's three-act comedy, The Lovelorn Brother, in Naples. In 1767, we saw the first performance of François-Joseph Gosset's Les Doubles Déguisements in Paris. Apologies to Oliver for that pronunciation. In 1818, Ferdinand Hérold's Le Premier Venu premiered. In 1863, Bizet's opera The Pearl Fishers premiered in Paris. In 1900, Mikhail Ippolitov Ivanov's Asya had its premiere in Moscow. And in 1908, it was the first performance of Victor Herbert's Little Nemo operetta in Philadelphia.
Couple of birthdays for September 30th. 1612 brought us the birth of Spanish composer Juan Hidalgo, who wrote the first two operas in Spanish. 1855 brought us the birth of German soprano Fanny Moran Olden. 1913 brought us the birth of American composer Vivian Fine, and guess where? Our fair city of Chicago. 1944 brought us the birth of English baritone Thomas Allen and Siam, and in 1976, happy birthday to Chinese American composer Wang Ro.
And that is your 2-minute drill.
Little bit of the Callas Scholars there to honor the wonderful Deborah Roberts. That was the Gregorio Allegri Miserere Mei Deus with embellishments by Deborah Roberts, and Peter Phillips was the director.
We were talking about the Opernwelt magazine sort of winners, but we want to point out that the friend of the show, Lucia Lucas, was nominated for the Singer of the Year. She posted about it on Facebook. She said, "I'm overwhelmed to find out that I was nominated for Singer of the Year by Egbert Toll for my portrayal of Lily Elba. I love her work. She's going up there, and I'm rooting for a win next year. Absolutely."
She will do just fine with or without that OBS bump. You know who else is doing just fine? Dresden's opera scene. My goodness.
This is a crazy amount of money. I love the juxtaposition of the stories here. We got Dresden getting millions of euros to do a Richard Wagner themed academy. I believe you did some calculations. It's about, in US dollars, it's what, 16.7,
almost $17 million to construct this new center dedicated to the music of Wagner and other 19th century folks.
And juxtapose that with Berlin. There was a budget crisis in Berlin, and they're throwing around a lot of artist cuts. Germany is in such an interesting position the past 2 or 3 years. I think ever since the pandemic hit, there's been sort of increasing sort of anxiety in that country surrounding the future of opera and classical music as like, Bayreuth continues to take financial hits, a lot of these other German companies, and Germany is the powerhouse in the world. I believe, I could be wrong on this, but I think they have more opera houses than the rest of the world, except for maybe Russia. And they are very much the sort of stalwart defenders of a lot of the kind of things we talk about here on the show. And when they're worried about money, I get worried too. But then I see something like, yeah, Berlin is struggling right now, but also you're dropping $16.7 million in Dresden on a brand new academy. Like, it just goes to show, how much better Germany has it in a lot of ways compared to the US, and how important that state funding is. And I think I don't want to diminish, the struggles that Germany is having at all, because if you lose that, as the United States did, as England did more recently with the Arts Council England defunding, things can go sour really fast. So at the first sign of those, moments of austerity where you start cutting the arts, that's when you have to really start kicking and screaming. And I'm glad they're kicking and screaming in Berlin. And I hope they can really turn that around before we start talking about it like we talk about England nowadays.
Well, the wild thing about this is that, this grant comes from Kultur Invest, which is a funding program that's from the federal government commissioner for culture and media. So is this something that goes all across Germany? Did they just choose Dresden and are leaving Berlin alone? I don't know enough about the organization, but I am, I like you have apprehension, because if they're having these sort of purse tightening, issues in Germany, what hope do we, Americans who don't nearly take this into the same sort of account as they do, what do we have to look forward to? Not the Verdi Requiem if you live in San Francisco. Sorry about that, patrons.
Yeah, I mean, labor organizing is certainly one possible solution to this mess. This is obviously very dramatic. Obviously, 100% of the chorus voting for a strike is something. We've been seeing a lot of, labor organizing in classical music over the last couple of years. And we continue to see these really high numbers of people voting in favor of actions, voting in favor of strikes. I think this might be the first time I've seen 100% of an organization voting in favor of it, though. And that is significant. That is not easy.
Exactly. Well, and I think the eligible voter population was also really high. It was like in the 70s. So like of the people that were eligible, it was more than half, close to 3/4. And then of the people that actually voted, 100% of them voted for the strike. Now, in the interest of transparency and full disclosure, I am a member of AGMA, which is the musicians union that these folks are also a member of. So by default, solidarity, fist in the air. But even if I weren't a member of AGMA, if you've got those kind of stats and odds for the people that voted for this, then yeah, absolutely, this is something that needs to happen. So, I mean, the power of collective bargaining is something that you see not just in the arts, but in many other areas of the workforce here in the United States. And they are designed to be a protectorate for employees. And so I am sad that they had to go on this 3-day strike, but I am optimistic that now that San Francisco Symphony has seen the weight of what it means when you don't have a chorus for something as magical as Verdi Requiem, thus cannot pull it off. Hopefully they'll be listening.
Yeah, you're definitely not doing Verdi's Requiem without a chorus.
Absolutely not.
But you might be doing it without liner notes if you're listening to an Apple Classical. There's my transition. This is, I think I should make a segment of Weston Talks about Apple Classical, because ever since I, adopted it to sort of see what it was about, I have seen the shortcomings. I've seen the promise. I've gotten worried about it very publicly. This is something that I think the last time we talked about, I was actually literally complaining about, was that, we have the streaming service that has the capability of showing lyrics for, pop music, and rock music and other genres, hip hop, but did not have it for anything in the classical world. But now they are implementing these liner notes and libretti, which is so essential for opera, so essential. it's very hard when I'm, talking to someone who doesn't know anything about opera and I'm trying to introduce them to the concept. And, they're leery about going to the opera and they want to just listen to something. And if they're intimidated, by even if it's in opera in English, it can be intimidating to hear, some of the higher soprano stuff. It's hard to even hear what they're saying unless the diction is impeccable and the recording is perfect. It really is such a valuable resource to have access to these libretti. I will say, when I was testing it, when I saw this article, pop out, I didn't know it was actually already on my phone, so I had to go searching for it. It's in the upper right. But the reason I didn't notice it is because a lot of the weird stuff I listened to, it is not there yet. And I hope it is yet and not at all. But, most of the newer stuff, and the really famous recordings have it, but a lot of them don't. And a lot of them are also running into the same problems with like licensing and stuff that you have, where certain recordings aren't available on streaming for one reason or another. Folks, I keep getting on the soapbox, and I do think it is something to, talk about and be aware of, is like, as these sorts of companies become bigger, and I am glad that Apple Classical is out there because it's easy for people to access. They have a large library available to them. You can find it pretty easily on your phone, even if you're not a classical music person. I must once again say we are at the whims of whatever CFO is out there, working at Apple, because one day they could say, actually, classical music isn't super profitable. We're just going to ditch it. The corporation giveth and the corporation taketh away. And at the moment it's givething, and I hope it doesn't taketh away.
I concur. However, I want to mention one thing before we wrap this show up. I want to pull the lens back on this a little bit. I agree with your points, but I also want to look at this from a brass tacks, logical labor perspective. When we're thinking about the categorizing and the collecting of liner notes, they're doing literally centuries of music. And so in the spirit of Apple, they continue to sort of update and add and change and improve. And so I think both of these things can happen. I think maybe with the new iteration of the next Apple Classical, mayhaps there will be even more liner notes and libretti, and possibly nurturing some of those more obscure recordings that my friend Weston Williams likes to go through. So my hope is, as much as I agree with you on this and worry about sort of like big music, big tech, I do wonder if maybe this is just Apple doing what Apple does, where they just like get better with every release that comes out. So maybe they'll expand that catalog a little bit more with every release that comes out. Maybe I'm being way too optimistic, but that's my hope.
It's a toss-up. We're heading for Star Trek or we're heading for Black Mirror. Let's hope it's Star Trek. Let's wrap this show up.
Good call. Bad call on Opera Box Score.
Good call, bad call. That's how we end the show around here. Ashley Hargrave, what do you have for me?
I know we talk a lot about the problems with different arts things in England, but this is a good thing that's happening right now. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, has announced a number of new initiatives across the arts. And so in music, one of the things is a new set of commissions for BBC Radio 3, which is going to have 25 different UK composers to write new works. 25 new works from 25 different composers. And here's the cool thing about it. So each of the composers are going to choose a year between the year 2000 and the year 2025, and they're going to compose a piece that reflects on a major world event that took place in that year. The full list of composers has not been released yet, but we see Thea Musgrave, we see Erilyn Wallen, Stephen Huff, Anna Klein. So Stephen Huff's going to commemorate the tragedy of 9/11. Thea Musgrave is going to reflect on the 2-year anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II's death. So it's going to be a really interesting piece of compositions. And in an era where, the arts in the UK are seeing all sorts of challenges, I really am excited to see all of these things coming out of BBC Radio 3.
That is it for this week's edition of America's Talk Radio Show about opera. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you get your pods. Get your voice heard. Find links to stuff we've talked about at our website, operaboxscore.com. That's also where you can put your money where our mouths are. Give back to the OBS using the Support the Team tab. Your announcer is Norm Waddell. Your creative consultant is Oliver Camacho, and your audio editor is me. The executive producer of the OBS is George Cedarquist. For co-host Ashley Hardgrave with guest Ricky Ian Gordon, I'm Weston Williams, asking you to continue the conversation about opera as you decide which German music city to fund. We're back with an all-new show next week, plus you get more opera headlines, more hot takes, and more obscure liner notes. Join us.